Hello, and welcome to the Let's Talk Transformation podcasts. Today, we will be looking at digital transformation and how to successfully deploy digital transformation across your organization. I am delighted to welcome Matt Kleiman, co-founder and CEO of Cumulus Digital Systems, and also the author of, in inverted commas, Work Done Right. We'll talk more about that later. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Susie. Great to be here.
It's great to have you. So, Matt, throughout your career in Shell, Draper Laboratory, and now Cumulus Digital Systems, you've always been taking a more holistic view on what digital means for the future, in terms of operations, of course, we'll come to that, but also in terms of technology and, of course, people and therefore competitive advantage. So in a way, it's like how to develop technical solutions, but while constantly improving operational context and also taking people with you on that journey, which, as we both know, is no mean feat. And I think is every leader's and organization's question today. So can we start there with your book, which is about that? It's about working right and using systemic thinking and systems thinking to guide you along your digital transformation strategy. So what inspired you to write Work Done Right, and why now?
Yeah, Work Done Right is really a collection of lessons that I've learned over the course of my career, which has spanned a few different industries: aerospace, energy, construction, data centers, and seeing common themes across those industries in terms of how to best achieve digital transformation and how not to achieve digital transformation. And it was really, I found I like writing, and I wrote, I've been writing blog posts and posts on social media. And then eventually it kind of just made sense to put it all together into a book for the purpose of, be able to hand it to somebody like who I was earlier in my career and say, maybe learn a few things from what I've seen work and not work, and skip a few hard lessons along the way. But it really was about seeing themes. And the reason for doing it now is I think we're in a transformational period where we as a society have to build a lot of infrastructure. Whether it's energy infrastructure, data centers for AI, repairing roads and bridges and things like that. And it's a problem all over the world. And we are not very good at that in terms of doing it on time and on budget. And we have cost overruns, we have a lot of quality issues. And there were things that I had seen in my career. It doesn't solve every single problem, but it certainly is a way of thinking about how to improve processes with technology that will hopefully help us and help project leaders get it right the first time. And that's why, you mentioned in quotes, work done right. That's when I think about it, get it done right the first time. Don't have to redo it again and again, which is what ends up causing a lot of problems and a lot of projects to fail.
And so there's quite a few subjects in there that I'd like to unpack as we go. So work done right and work not done right, as you say, you talk about, if we take the analogy of a caterpillar and a butterfly, that work not done right is an expensive caterpillar. And I like that because it's very visual, but also because, if you do everything by the book, you can do everything by the book and just put it in place without thinking, and you will have an expensive caterpillar. So let's start there. What is the methodology behind Work Done Right? And can you walk us through a couple of examples where it was done wrong?
Sure. So Work Done Right is about there's a couple of parts to it. It's about both process and culture. So there's an element of process, and what I talk about in the book is systems thinking, which is to think about your project or a facility as an interconnected whole. And I like the example you used of a caterpillar. For any living organism, a human, caterpillar, whatever it might be, it's a system. And
of course.
A lot of things have to work together in order to make something happen, whether it's that transformation into a butterfly or a human being healthy or not. It's your nervous system, your respiratory system, your circulatory system. Everything has to work together, and too often, especially in industry, we are very siloed. in terms of how
Yeah,
we
massively.
have our organizational charts and our boxes, and this is my job, this is your job, and I'm going to think about my piece of the puzzle and not yours. And that's often where things fail, is in the handoffs between those silos. So, so it's systems thinking, thinking of your project, business, whatever it might be, as a system. Two, it's making sure that you, in terms of quality, within that system, write down what you're going to do, and then put systems in place to make sure you're actually doing what you're supposed to be doing. And from a cultural perspective, when it comes to work quality, make sure we're not inadvertently creating a culture of fear or intimidation of not speaking up. We as the industry has done a lot around safety and bringing safety into cultures. And hey, if you see something that's unsafe, speak up and be rewarded for that. We don't do the same thing for work quality. There's often an implicit peer pressure to, hey, don't talk about what's not. We have a budget, we have a schedule to meet. We can't spend more money on this. And so how are you as a culture making sure you're encouraging people to speak up? I know that was a lot, but that's the various themes we talk about for how you can make sure that you have the processes in place to bring work quality in an organization. And where it fails, there's a lot of examples in the book from my career, but for your audience, I think a great example is what's going on with Boeing right now. And the accident that happened last month with the Alaska Airlines 737. There's still it's still being investigated, so we're going to learn a lot more. But based on the reports that have come out so far, as of when we're recording this, it looks like the plane was going through the manufacturing process. We had to go from a subcontractor to Boeing. Somebody took a door off. They did some work on it, this door plug. And when they put the door back in, they forgot to put the bolts. There were 4 bolts that attached the door to the aircraft, and they just forgot, somehow missed it. Just human error, pure human error.
A relatively simple mistake when you put it like that.
A relatively simple mistake. But what was remarkable is not only that it wasn't so much remarkable that a person forgot to do something. People forget, who are in a rush, forget to do things all the time. But Boeing clearly didn't have processes in place to that piece of write down what you do and then have the systems in place to confirm that you're doing what you're doing. Write down. Somehow that wasn't caught. And because people tend to, again, there's peer pressure to not speak up about process failures or quality failures. I'm sure we're going to learn a lot more about the specifics that went into that incident, and thank goodness that nobody was hurt in that where someone very much could have been. But that kind of thing happens all the time. We know how, from a technical and engineering perspective, to build and construct and maintain things, whether it's airplanes or buildings or bridges or power plants or wind turbines, whatever it might be. But we're human, and humans make mistakes, and we don't account for that in that process. We don't consider humans part of the system that I talked about, where the human workers are very much part of that system. And we need to make sure the very real possibility of humans making mistakes are accounted for, and we do everything we can to catch them before somebody gets hurt.
Yeah, and I think, I did a lot of lean on the supply chain earlier on in my career in aerospace, actually. And, you have, and you have these standard operating procedures, you have the and-on, you have the whole sort of lean toolkit, but there's a mindset, isn't there, that goes with that. And I think we're on Amy Edmondson's discussion around daring to speak up and bringing up things that actually are due to human error. But there's also the translatability, isn't there, of approaches from one industry to another. And just on this sort of lean subject around root cause analysis and problem definition and solution definition, you give a great example of Shell, where they take systems engineering from aerospace and they put it into the oil and gas industry. Can you walk us through that example? For me, that's an example of what you've just talked about, but also of the sort of translatability of skill set, but also ways of working from one industry to another, that we don't ever look outside our system to see if there are any alternatives.
So absolutely, and it's a story I talk about in the book, as you mentioned, and it's the story of my career because I was working in aerospace originally at a company called Draper Laboratory here in the Boston area, and one Draper Laboratory is a recognized expert in controlling and control systems for aircraft and spacecraft. And after the Deepwater Horizon disaster, that's the BP, also known as the BP oil spill in Mexico in 2010, a number of energy companies, Shell was one of them, came to Draper and said, we want to learn, and much credit to these energy companies that did this. They said, look, this was, even though this was BP, it could have happened to any of us.
Of course.
And we want to learn from other industries that have a track record of safely operating in hazardous environments. And Boeing issues aside, aerospace has a phenomenal,
of course, massively regulated
of safety, especially in the last decades. We were kids, and air crashes were much more common than they are today, where it's shocking when you hear of an incident. A lot of engineering and went into engineering away safety risk, and the energy industry, the energy companies like Shell and others wanted to learn about how can they rethink their own processes for building and maintaining facilities to prevent something from like Deepwater Horizon from happening again. And what really resonated was this concept of systems engineering and systems thinking, which had existed in the aerospace world for quite some time, but hadn't really been applied to energy infrastructure. And I started working, leading a project from Draper, working with these companies, and eventually was hired by Shell to bring this capability in-house to say, this is great what we're doing with Draper, but we want to have an internal capability to do this. And I worked for Shell for 6 years, building teams that looked at all parts of the energy value chain, from exploration, production, refining, renewables, basically everything an energy company does, and applying systems thinking, systems engineering methodologies to figure out how we could engineer out safety risk.
And what was your biggest challenge there? Because you've essentially taken the end-to-end value chain, which, as you say, is often not seen from the top as an end-to-end value chain. It's often my part of this value chain, and I'll just look at my part. So it's interesting to put systems engineering on top of that. And I think it's never been more topical than today, Matt, when everything is interlinked with technology. We'll come to the technology part later. But what was your biggest challenge in those 6 years at Shell of trying to get everyone to, one, understand the end-to-end value chain, and two, to understand where they added value in that chain?
I think as you mentioned, the biggest challenge was getting over the silos that any large organization naturally builds these up over time, and people become specialized. In HR incentivize looking out for your own silo. It just becomes part of a bureaucracy.
My territory.
My territory. And then related to that is, well, this is how, I now have a job. This is how the person in the job before me did this job. And look, they got promoted and moved on in their career. I don't want to rock the boat. So I am going to do my job the same way the last person did, because that's the way to get promoted and to advance in your career. And that's what I mean by these HR incentives that almost disincentivize thinking outside the box.
They standardize ways of getting promoted.
Standardized ways of getting promoted. And again, it's all about human nature. It's very natural to say, all right, I have a career and I want to, here's the person who had this job before me, and I look at them and, they're doing well. I want to do the same thing, so I'm going to do what they did. And if an outsider like me comes into the organization and says, well, actually, there's a better way to do this, we should look at this in a different way. Whether it's a supply chain issue, or it's using new technology, or maybe you have to reevaluate which contractors you're using on projects, whatever the issue might be, there's a lot of career risk in that. Forget the risk of
Mm.
whether the recommendation is going to succeed or fail on the technical or commercial merits. There is career risk
Yeah.
in doing it differently.
Mm.
And so getting over that career risk fear and showing people, one, how de-risking that. So, hey, it's not actually as risky as you think it is. There's big opportunity in doing this. Make sure that their whole line management chain understands what we're doing, so that they're supportive of it and they could de-risk it for that person. That ended up being where I spent a lot of my time
I believe you.
managing issues like that, not so much on
Mm.
the evaluating any particular technology and doing pilots and all the things you do to actually get the technology deployed into the field.
Mm. We're back onto the relationship discussion though, aren't we, about understanding where you fit into that culture.
Yeah.
And what that culture recognizes, and whether you are incentivized, to come back to your discussion around HR incentives, to either work together or not, and how the performance structure is set up. I think it's really interesting to look at these two competing elements of culture and the way we do things around here, and the sort of process technology piece.
Mm-hmm.
And also, how can we balance these two elements of what I'm going to call explore and exploit? So, the culture of business as usual, and the standardization and the continuous improvement of those processes, and the motivation of the people to do that. And also being able to step out of the box, as you say, and think a little bit differently, accept different ideas, and start thinking more to the future of how we could do this differently, because they're two very different cultures, aren't they?
They are, absolutely. And one thing I talk about to that point in the book is a lot of people try to do change for the sake of change, or it's technology looking for a problem to solve. And the challenge people run into is you need to recognize and appreciate why systems were put in place in the first place. And an example I talk about in the book is, a refinery is very conservative about making changes to a process for very good reasons. Because if something goes wrong at a refinery, as we unfortunately see, people get hurt or killed. These refineries are often adjacent to communities. You could have chemicals released into the atmosphere, to the groundwater. And so a conservative resistance to change was put in place for a good reason. And it's important to respect that and to not belittle that culture. And so as much as we talk about change and thinking outside the box, and that's very much been some part of my career, it's also, if you're going to be effective at it, and that's part of this whole thinking of everything as a system, to understand why it all works together, is, well, there's reasons for everything. You typically don't see a person in a job coming in and saying, I'm going to make this process as inefficient as possible, because that's what I want to do today. Something happened that at the time someone made a decision that was the right decision, likely, or a decision that at least made sense at the time. And so to balance change and to have change within a larger context, so that it could be de-risked properly, is equally as important as getting people to think outside the box.
And I think, digital transformation isn't about ripping everything out and redoing the whole thing, is it? Exactly like you say, there are things in organizations and systems that work really well, and that's why they're there. And system has memory, of course, and keeps them going. But it reminds me of, I love, you label it the splashing technology syndrome.
Yes.
I love that, when, the processes may be working okay, the people are sort of doing it, but the splashing technology syndrome is great. Can you just walk us through that? Because I think that's often what goes first and what decisions are made around, when really maybe it should be something else. Can you just walk us through that?
Yeah, the splashy technology system, the
I love
acronym
that.
STS, which is that when people want to bring digital transformations to the organization, it's very easy to focus on whatever the current technology hype cycle is hyping. And we've seen over the last even just 5 years, multiple hype cycles, whether, starting with IoT, the Internet of Things, cryptocurrencies, now AI. All of these technologies have valuable uses, but there's also an element of hype in all of them.
Of course.
Saying they do more than they do, but whatever is either in the news or what people are seeing their colleagues doing, and wanting to make, and people are gravitate towards those technologies. So for a while, it was crypto, and you saw things like smart contracts and how are we going to transform the energy supply chain with crypto-driven smart contracts, and that's going to change everything. And it turned out nothing really ever came of it, because while crypto may or may not have uses, I'm really not that into crypto landscape, so I can't speak to it too much. But it's not, there are too many other things that have to happen for smart contracts to be adopted that just made no sense in the context of the energy infrastructure. But that was a splashy technology, and it attracted millions in funding from organizations and investors. And so in the book, we talk about, to actually have really effective digital transformation, the digital transformation isn't the end goal in and of itself. There's a business goal you want to achieve, and you figure out what technology or process change or culture change makes the most sense. And it may or may not be whatever the hyped technology of the day is.
And I think that's really important, because I think that the business objective and the business strategy, as you say, is often lost. And with the splashing technology, you also get FOMO for me. And it's a race towards, what's my AI strategy? What's my IoT strategy? What we're going to do with this? What we're going to do with that?
Right.
And there are smart people around a table deciding what their company is going to do with that. So it's not devoid of sense, but is it sense making back into the organization when I look at the business vision and the business objectives? And how do you see that affecting digital transformation, Matt? Because if I take generative AI more particularly, I'm really interested in your take on what that will bring to this whole story of work done right, or deploying for sustainable change.
Yeah, so two things. One, what the consequence of the splashy technology syndrome is, often people become very jaded towards true digital transformation and true opportunities, because what happens is people spend a lot of money on a system, either as a pilot, or maybe you get to a full implementation, you bring in all kinds of consultants and other people to help you. And then eventually at some point, when all the cameras and videos and marketing goes away, you realize, oh man, this really didn't change anything at all, or maybe it even made it worse. And so you get a generation of people who are just jaded on technology, and we see it from my company today all the time, that we go to have a prospective client, and somebody says, oh, we tried something 5 years ago and it cost a lot of money, and then the company went under and it didn't work, and then you lose out on a lot of opportunities because it closes people off to change. It reinforces the conservative bias that they may have already had. It creates a new one. So that's the real impact, I think, of splashy technology syndrome, is not just the waste of money and loss of opportunity, but is creating undue skepticism in people that any technology can be helpful. Now, turning to generative AI, I am actually incredibly bullish on generative AI. I've seen it in my own business, how it's starting to become transformational. And I'll give an example of how it's becoming transformational. But like any technology, it's still super early, and you can't, and I wouldn't recommend to any large company to bet the farm, other than somebody who's, building generative AI tools, to make any long-term irreversible decisions based on where the technology is today. I think that it's incredibly exciting, but it's still early. So
Mm.
where I am especially excited about generative AI in industry and in construction is we have a data problem in construction
Mm-hmm.
where there was a study that more than 90% of data that's generated on a construction project isn't used for anything. It's
Mm.
generated, it sits somewhere, and the reasons are all the ones we've been talking about: silos, systems that
Mm.
don't talk to each other, things are in paper in a binder somewhere and not accessible, or in a
Mm.
spreadsheet that's on somebody's computer. For all these reasons, formatting is different, compatibility is different. And what I have seen real examples of in my own business is that large language models are able to make sense of data that is messy.
Yeah.
And that has typically been a big problem in other former generations of AI tools. I remember when I was in Shell, having a number of small and large companies come to pitch us on AI tools. And this was
Mm.
in the 2015, 2016 time period, where it was, hey, give us all your data in parentheses that's perfectly formatted and in this very specific
Mm.
very specific format, and it doesn't have any errors in it. And then my tool can give you all kinds of great insights. Well, of course, we had no data that was clean and
Mm.
properly formatted and didn't have mistakes and didn't have incompatible units and all the other things that happen in large organizations. And that, I think, limited the usability and usefulness of the prior versions of AI. And it created a lot of skepticism, including in people like myself who were being sold on these things and
Mm.
saw, yeah, there's no way this could actually be useful to us.
Mm.
What I've seen with LLMs is that the technology has advanced to where these models can make sense of messy data. They're not perfect at it yet. And you see, Google right now, as we're recording, Google is having egg on its face because of
Yeah.
decisions they made about how they certain biases they put into these models,
Mm.
and they'll figure it out, and other companies will figure it out. But the underlying capability is really exciting because I've seen it look at very messy data sets, even with our own customers,
Mm.
actually make sense out of it. And because of that, took something that required a human a long time, hours, days, weeks to do, and get it done in minutes.
Mm.
And that is really exciting and potentially transformational for the industry.
Mm. And I think it's really exciting as well for what it means for the role humans are going to play in the digital transformation process.
Absolutely.
It's a journey, isn't it? Like you said, it's not a project with a tick box. It's a journey and an evolution of hopefully a beautiful butterfly, not an expensive caterpillar. But can you tell us a little bit about your vision, Matt, for what the role humans are going to play in the digital transformation process as generative AI and large language models and other derivatives come into the process, into that three concentric circles of technology, process, people?
Yep. I think that in the long term, there will always be a place for humans. The
Mm.
humans are not going to be supplanted entirely, uh, because there's an element of human decision-making and
Yeah.
experience that, at least based on where technology is today,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem to be replaceable.
Mm.
And the companies and people that are most successful are the people who can use tools like generative AI and LLMs and others to improve their own decision making. And I talk about a concept in the book, I think near the end of the book, called the OODA loop,
Yes, I
which
was
is,
going to ask you about that.
yeah,
Let's
which is
go.
this concept. It was originally developed for the military, but it's been
Mm-hmm.
applied widely, which is OODA, OODA, observe, orient, decide, and act. And that's a process. It was originally developed for fighter pilots. You observe your opponent, you orient yourself in relation to the opponent, decide, act, and then you go through that loop again. And the pilot who has the most effective and fastest OODA loop is typically the one who will win a dogfight.
Okay.
And you can apply this to almost any competitive endeavor,
Mm.
including business.
Mm.
Because if we're able to use AI to take the 10% of data that we're generating today and turn that into 50, 60, or close to 100% of the data actually being accessible and useful, we as managers, people, leaders can have a much more effective OODA loop, make decisions that are right a lot more often than they are, that are timely a lot more often than they are, and just make our businesses better in every sense of the word, because we're able to do that no matter what our endeavor is.
And I love that idea of the OODA loop, and also the fact that what was becoming clear as you were explaining it to our listeners was that it's also, you can incentivize it if that's what you decide to do, and it's also iterative. So it fits into a more sort of build, measure, learn type of model that we can use in organizations. What does it mean for the culture, Matt? What does it mean for, I'm taking the hypothesis that the OODA loop will drive sustainable digital transformation in an organization. What does that mean for the culture and for the leadership that needs to accompany it?
It means one, as you just pointed out, the incentives have to be aligned with the successful implementation of the OODA loop. Two, it's a loop. It's not a one-time thing. Very often in organizations, we think we do something once and then we're done. Can pat ourselves on the back, check off the check mark. All right, we observed, we oriented, we decided, and we act. Well, that if you do it once, that doesn't get you anywhere. And so organizations have to get in a learning mindset that we don't know everything, but we can always continuously improve ourselves. And that means continuously running through the OODA loop. So you observe, decide, act, and then observe again how that action has changed the situation, whatever situation you're in, and then reorient, redecide, act. And it's a never-ending loop until you achieve whatever your business objective is. And maybe that's the end of a project, and then the project is over, whatever it might be. That is, I think, companies that master that skill set will be the leaders of the next decades or centuries.
And just to come back to your more holistic view around systems thinking, do you think that organizations and leaders can put in place a learning mindset without having a systems thinking lens?
Probably not, because if you don't have a systems thinking lens, the observe part of the OODA loop is going to be very difficult or very incomplete. And you're going to be making decisions on incomplete data. And examples, for instance, you might be trying to improve efficiency at your facility, maybe just more uptime at your facility. And if you are the manager of the maintenance team, you're going to be looking at what the maintenance team can be doing better. But there might be externalities such as around supply chain, material manufacturing, the weather, whatever it might be, that are affecting the uptime of your facility. And if you're not considering all those other things, then, and you're just focusing on, in the example, the maintenance team, you're going to come to very likely the wrong, or at least an incomplete conclusion of how you achieve that business objective. And so if we have to break down those organizational silos in order to do the OODA loop the right way. And it all kind of fits together in systems thinking, informing the OODA loop. The OODA loop then improves your system.
And as a CEO, what is your biggest leadership challenge, Matt, in terms of sustainable digital transformation? Because there are lots of leadership challenges around digital transformation, but I'm particularly interested in the adoption process. So like you say, we get quite excited about the upfront technology project, what we're doing, everyone's bought in, and then suddenly we have to make it work when the proof of concept is ready and we need to put it back into the organization.
I would say it's stamina, organizational stamina to keep going and to not stop at the initial sign of either success or failure of something. Now, failing fast, I think, is important, and to say, yep, this isn't working, we have to cut it. But sometimes, sometimes things don't go well for reasons that can be fixed, and to have the stamina to proceed through it. But I think it's even more important when something does go well, you have a successful pilot, you have a successful demonstration, everybody is excited. But at some point, the excitement's going to go away, and there has to be somebody in place who's going to sustain that and continue to grow whatever the transformation is. And way too often in organizations, that stamina doesn't last more than a couple of budget cycles, or maybe an HR cycle. And things change, and then organizational inertia takes over, and then things just kind of go back to the way they are over time, and there isn't any attention to it anymore. So, because people think the problem is solved, and it goes back. That is what I see as, among many different challenges, the most challenging for someone trying to implement lasting change.
Organizational stamina. I like that. And what do you think is the root cause to that? If you were to take it back down to sort of the root cause of that particular challenge, where would you be looking?
One, I think I very much believe everything goes back to human nature. We've talked about it a few times before, and it's very hard, just like it's hard to keep an exercise regimen going, or a diet going, or anything for our own self-improvement. For all the same human failings, it's hard. Change is hard, and it's a lot easier to just kind of let it go. And I'm gonna do, as we talked about it in the beginning of our discussion, I'm gonna do this the same way the last person did it. Just like it's a lot easier to say, oh, not going to get up early to go to the gym this morning, or I'm going to go stop and eat fast food on the way home from work. For the same exact psychology goes into not having the stamina to keep up that change. And you could apply very much all the same methodologies. I heard on another podcast I was listening to, someone talking about AI as organizational or corporate Ozempic. Ozempic being the drug that's supposedly the miracle drug helping with weight loss, but that it's going to help organizations lose weight in terms of make better structure, decisions, better financials. And they were being sarcastic, but I think the point they were making is corporations are like people, and the motivation, the miracle, if there is a miracle drug for people, maybe AI will be that for corporations. We'll see. I think there's a lot of asterisks there, but it's an interesting way of thinking about it.
It is an interesting way of thinking about it, and also thinking about, I'm a big fan of what model works for us, which is essentially what you're saying with work done right, is find out what works for you, find out what your need is, define it properly, and deploy accordingly.
Absolutely.
So it's interesting. I mean, time is running, but I do have a couple of questions. One of them would be, what's the most transformative thing, Matt, that you've ever done in terms of digital transformation, over and above writing your book? Because your book is essentially a blueprint for how to be transformative, or should I say, that's the way I read it. And that's with all the different case studies and proposals, because they're not rules, they're proposals for different ways of working, different ways of thinking.
So the most transformational thing that I've done is a project that actually became the company that I'm the CEO of now.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I'm not saying this to talk my own horn, but I created Cumulus because of this change, to bring it to other places, because we started it in Shell. But the oil and gas industry has a problem with leaking pipe connections. So any kind of oil and gas industry is a series of thousands and thousands of pipes. If you've driven by a refinery, you've seen there's this web, this entanglement of piping. And most leaks are because the piping is not assembled correctly. Again, it goes back
Human
to
error.
human error. I mean, there's things like corrosion and
Mm,
other things that happen. But as far as preventable issues, it's the piping has to be assembled and somebody puts a part on backwards or doesn't tighten the bolts properly or whatever the
mm,
reason be. There's a process for assembling the pipes and somebody doesn't follow it. And the industry typically had been, how do you solve this? Well, let's bring in more inspectors. Let's bring in more paperwork to fill out. Well, over decades, the leak rates never improved, no matter how much paperwork or how many inspectors we
mm,
brought to check the work. But what we saw was, well, what if we were able to get data from the field as the pipes were being assembled? And we saw that manufacturers of torque wrenches, these are wrenches that tighten bolts, were starting to put Bluetooth radios into their torque wrenches.
mm,
And they were doing that for asset management inventory purposes. But we said, well, what if we could use that connectivity to actually get to, one, guide the worker through what they're supposed to do, but also get a real-time confirmation that, yep, that worker actually tightened those bolts properly.
mm.
The worker actually installed that pipe properly based on the data we're getting from the tools and from a mobile device that they're using in the field. And that, so relatively from as far as technological change point of view, it was a very simple change. Just the worker does their work the same way. We're just swapping out the tools that they're using to something we can pull data off of and use. And that had an immediate transformation where you had about 20%
Brilliant. Mm,
of these piping connections leaking to we published a study with a few of our customers that said went from 20% to 0.1%.
wow. Oh, that's huge.
Was huge. And
Yeah.
just that, a relatively simple, didn't require redesigning how we build and operate facilities, but it was figuring out where the failure point was. And that failure point is the person in the
Mm,
field following a process, and figuring out a simple way to get real-time data that will identify problems as they're happening so that you could fix it there. Nope, the worker did not assemble that in the right way. Let's fix it before we turn on the facility and have a problem.
mm. And
So
it's great. And
uh,
it's a great
yeah,
example of not falling into the blame game, which is easy,
exactly. Yep,
and
exactly.
actually thinking outside that box of sort of catastrophizing and thinking, okay, that let me get curious about that and see what we could do. And it's a relatively
Right.
simple idea that has a massive impact.
Right. And exactly. And we figured it out because we applied systems thinking to understand why is it that these leaks were happening,
Mm,
and and what is the most efficient way to prevent, once we identify that failure point, to remediate that failure point. And it wasn't having somebody come and inspect it a week later
mm,
after the fact, because they may or may not discover something. And it's
mm.
really, once a pipe is assembled, it's really hard to tell from the
Yes,
outside if it
yes.
was assembled properly.
Mm,
You need to catch it as it's happening, or else visually it looks like any other pipe.
mm. Interesting. And just moving on, therefore, what would your recommendations or call to action be for our listeners who are thinking, okay, I need to do something with our digital transformation strategy and
Yep.
deployment strategy?
My call to action is, one, think about, before you decide, one, avoid splashy technology syndrome. You're probably already
Yeah.
falling into it. You're already excited about, you're being pitched by startups, large companies, internal colleagues on whatever, probably now it's AI or whatever
Mm,
the hot technology is. Avoid that. Don't make any decisions yet. Think about your business objective, identify why your organization is not currently achieving that objective, and think expansively, think
mm,
beyond just your own. And hopefully, if you're in a position to, if you're in a leadership position, enlist other people who can help you with this, and use some of the methodologies that we've talked about over the last 45 minutes to help you identify what the, to go through your own OODA loop, to
mm,
observe an organization, orient yourself. How can I best overcome whatever the challenges are that I'm seeing, make a decision, act, and then repeat again, and keep iterating on it until you solve the problem.
Excellent.
But start with thinking about the problem and your organization as a system before just jumping after a technology.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to leave our listeners with the idea of adapting their OODA loops to their systems.
Yep.
Matt, thank you very much for coming and sharing your insight, your stories, your case studies. Where can people find out more about you, Cumulus, and what you do?
Sure. Thanks, Susie. It's been great. Best place to reach me is on LinkedIn. I'm very active there. So just search Matthew Kleiman at Cumulus, like a Cumulus cloud, and you'll find me on LinkedIn. Look forward to hearing from people, and I'm very active there. And then my company's website is Cumulus DS, as in Cumulus Digital Systems, cumulusds.com, and you can find out a lot of information there as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for a great conversation.
Thanks, Susie. Great being here.